At 3:47 a.m., when $47 billion of infrastructure collapsed in 16 minutes, the CEO of Nexora Systems made a phone call she never imagined making, to a man she'd fired 3 months earlier. A man whose name wasn't even in the system anymore. A man who showed up to save the company in a faded jacket that still smelled like his daughter's breakfast cereal. This is the story of Ethan Walker, the ghost in the machine, the architect everyone forgot, and the father who walked away from power because he'd already made a promise about pancakes. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The fluorescent lights in Nexora Systems' basement server room flickered at 6:23 a.m., casting shadows across rows of humming machines that most employees never knew existed. Ethan Walker stood beneath those lights with a circuit tester in one hand and a half-eaten granola bar in the other, checking voltage regulators that kept the building's infrastructure from cooking itself alive. Nobody looked at him twice. He'd learned to be invisible here. It was easier that way. Safer. The worn canvas jacket he wore, brown, fraying at the cuffs, permanent grease stain on the left sleeve, had become a uniform of anonymity. People saw the jacket before they saw the man. When executives passed him in hallways, their eyes slid right over him like he was furniture. Maintenance staff, background noise. The guy who fixed the air conditioning when it broke. Ethan preferred it that way. At 32, he'd mastered the art of being unremarkable. He kept his head down, his mouth shut, and his daughter's crayon drawing currently taped inside his toolbox, close to his chest. The drawing showed two stick figures holding hands under a crooked sun. Mia had labeled them in purple marker, Daddy and me. That drawing mattered more than anything happening 6 floors above him, where people in tailored suits made decisions about systems they didn't understand. "Walker, you down there?" The voice crackled through the ancient intercom mounted near the server racks. Ethan recognized it. Jerry Fisk, day shift supervisor, probably calling about the HVAC unit on the 3rd floor that had been making that grinding noise since Tuesday. Ethan pressed the talk button. "Yeah, I'm here. CEO's office is having temperature issues. Someone needs to check it before she arrives at 8. "Copy that, Mup." Ethan set down his tools, wiped his hands on a rag that had been white sometime in 2019, and headed for the service elevator. The building was waking up around him. He could hear it in the way the ventilation system changed pitch, in the distant hum of computers booting up, in the muffled voices of early arrivals grabbing coffee in the lobby. The executive floor smelled different than the basement, cleaner, like money and carpet shampoo. Ethan moved through it like a shadow, accessing the climate control panel hidden behind a piece of modern art that probably cost more than his annual salary. The thermostat showed 72 degrees, which was exactly where it should be. He checked the airflow anyway, because that's what you did when someone complained. Rich people had very specific ideas about comfortable. He was closing the panel when he heard voices approaching. "Complete overhaul of the technical team. We can't afford to maintain legacy inefficiencies." Ethan recognized that voice. Dominic Hale, Chief Operating Officer, mid-40s, silver hair, suits that cost what Ethan made in a month. The kind of executive who used words like synergy without irony. Ethan didn't move, didn't announce himself. He'd learned that lesson early. When executives were talking, maintenance staff didn't exist unless spoken to. "I understand the concern, Dominic, but we're talking about replacing the entire infrastructure team." This voice was newer, female, younger. Had to be Evelyn Carter, the new CEO who'd taken over from the retiring founder 3 weeks ago. Ethan had seen her exactly once, passing through the lobby in designer heels that clicked like gunshots against marble. Not replacing, upgrading. Dominic's voice carried the practiced smoothness of a man who'd sold many things to many people. "The current team is competent, certainly, but they're maintaining systems designed 15 years ago. We need fresh perspective, people who understand modern architecture." They were right outside now. Ethan stayed absolutely still, blending into the wall beside the abstract painting. "What about Walker? The infrastructure documentation lists him as, maintenance technician," Dominic interrupted smoothly. "Good with his hands, fixes what breaks, but he's not strategic. Not someone you build a future around. He's exactly the kind of legacy and efficiency I'm talking about." Ethan's jaw tightened. The new team, Carter, Adrian, and Isaac, They're the best in the industry, Dominic continued. Headhunted from Silver Point Technologies. They've designed systems for companies twice our size. They'll modernize everything, optimize what we have, and position us for the next decade of growth. And the current staff? Reassignments where it makes sense. Severance packages where it doesn't. Clean, professional, necessary. Their voices faded as they moved down the hallway. Ethan stood there for another 30 seconds, breathing slowly through his nose. Then he picked up his toolkit and walked back toward the service elevator, his reflection ghosting across polished windows that showed a city waking up to another ordinary Tuesday. Nobody knew. That was the thing that made his chest tight sometimes, late at night when Mia was sleeping and the apartment was quiet. Nobody at Nexora Systems knew that the maintenance guy in the basement had designed the entire infrastructure they were discussing. That every server configuration, every redundancy protocol, every thermal management system had been architected by him 7 years ago when the company was still small enough to operate out of a converted warehouse. He'd been 25 then, young enough to work 70-hour weeks and call it passion, smart enough to build systems that could scale to handle exponential growth, naive enough to think his work would speak for itself. It had spoken. Nexora had grown from a regional hosting provider to a global infrastructure giant. The systems Ethan built had handled that growth without breaking, without catastrophic failures, without the kind of spectacular collapses that made headlines. And somewhere along the way, people had forgotten who built them. Or more accurately, they'd never really known. Ethan had been a contractor back then, hired through a third-party staffing company. His name had appeared in documentation as E. Walker, Systems Architect. But when Nexora transitioned to full-time employees, he'd been brought on as a technician. The executive team had changed. The original founder who'd known Ethan's work had retired to Montana to fish and forget about servers. The new people like Dominic Hale, only saw job titles. Ethan had thought about correcting the record once or twice. Walking into someone's office with the original design documents that still carried his digital signature. Explaining that the legacy systems they wanted to replace weren't legacy at all. They were carefully designed architecture that looked simple because he'd made it work flawlessly. But he never did. Because correcting that record meant putting a target on his back. Meant becoming visible. Meant the kind of corporate attention that came with expectations and politics and 80-hour weeks. And Mia needed him home for dinner. The service elevator descended with a hydraulic groan that Ethan made a mental note to check later. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Text message from his neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who watched Mia in the mornings before school. She ate all her oatmeal this morning and wanted me to tell you she learned a new song in music class. Something about ducks. Ethan smiled despite the tension still sitting in his shoulders. He typed back, "Tell her I want a full concert tonight. With choreography." 3 dots appeared. Then, "She's already planning it. Fair warning, it involves interpretive dance." The elevator reached the basement. Ethan stepped out into the familiar hum of machinery, the smell of warm electronics and industrial cleaning products. Down here, the world made sense. Circuits either worked or they didn't. Problems had solutions. Nobody cared about your job title if you could fix what was broken. He'd been living in this comfortable invisibility for 3 years now, ever since Mia's mother had died, and Ethan had restructured his entire life around a 6-year-old who suddenly needed him to be more than brilliant. She needed him to be present. So he'd stopped working late, stopped volunteering for complex projects, stopped trying to impress anyone. He'd become the guy who fixed things and went home at 5:30, the guy who never caused problems or asked for raises, the guy whose performance reviews said things like reliable and consistent instead of innovative or exceptional. It had been working fine. But now Dominic Hale was bringing in replacements, fresh perspective, people who understood modern architecture. Ethan pulled out his phone and opened his banking app. His savings account showed $8,247.63. Not enough for a catastrophic gap in employment. Definitely not enough if he needed to lawyer up for custody issues. Not that anyone was threatening that, but the fear lived in his chest anyway, a cold weight that never fully dissolved. He'd figure it out. He always did. The rest of the morning passed in familiar rhythms. He replaced a failing power supply in server room B, investigated a mysterious beeping on the 9th floor that turned out to be someone's forgotten phone alarm, ate lunch at his desk, leftover pasta Mia had insisted on packing for him, complete with a napkin that said, "Good luck, Daddy," in crayon. At 2:15 p.m., his supervisor called him into the office. Jerry Fisk was 58 and counting down to retirement like a man watching water boil. He looked uncomfortable, which immediately told Ethan everything he needed to know. "Walker, sit down." Ethan sat. Jerry pulled out a folder, standard HR paperwork. "Corporate's doing some restructuring. Nothing personal, you understand. They're bringing in a new engineering team, consolidating some positions." He slid the folder across the desk. "Severance package. 4 weeks' pay. Continuation of benefits for 60 days, standard non-disclosure agreement." Ethan looked at the folder without touching it. "When?" "End of week. Friday's your last day. 4 days." "They say why?" Jerry shrugged, looking miserable. "You know how it is. New management, new ideas. They want their own people." He paused. "For what it's worth, you're good at what you do. Best technician I've had. This isn't about performance." "It never is," Ethan said quietly. He took the folder, shook Jerry's hand, walked back to his desk in the basement, and sat there staring at the crayon drawing taped inside his toolbox. His phone buzzed. Another text from Mrs. Chen. "Picking Mia up from school in an hour. Still good for me to keep her until 6? Ethan typed back, "Perfect. Thank you." He had 4 days to figure out his next move. 4 days to find another job, update a resume he hadn't touched in 3 years, start applying to positions that probably paid less and definitely offered worse benefits. 4 days before he had to tell Mia that things were changing again. She'd been through enough changes. Her mother dying when she was 3, moving to a smaller apartment because the old one had too many memories, starting kindergarten, then 1st grade. Each transition had been hard in ways that broke Ethan's heart because he couldn't fix them with tools or logic. He could rebuild a server from components. He could diagnose network failures by sound, but he couldn't make a 6-year-old understand why the world kept taking things away. At 5:28 p.m., Ethan shut down his workstation and locked his toolbox. The basement was quiet except for the eternal hum of cooling systems. He took the service elevator up, walked past the security desk with a nod to Marcus, who'd been working nights since forever, and stepped out into October air that smelled like rain coming. The bus ride home took 40 minutes. Ethan spent it staring out the window, watching the city roll past in familiar patterns. The Thai restaurant where he and Mia got takeout every Friday. The library where they spent Saturday mornings. The park with the good swings and the duck pond. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Ethan answered anyway because you had to when you were job hunting. "Is this Ethan Walker?" "Speaking. Mr. Walker, this is Amanda Reeves from Tech Staff Solutions. We received your resume for the infrastructure position at Dataline Industries. I'd like to schedule a phone screening for—" "I haven't sent out my resume yet," Ethan interrupted. Pause. "Oh, I apologize. We must have had you in our system from a previous submission. Are you currently seeking employment?" "Not yet, but I will be soon." "Perfect. I'll note that in your file. Feel free to reach out when you're ready to explore opportunities." Ethan hung up and stared at his phone. He hadn't submitted his resume anywhere, hadn't even opened the document in 2 years. Someone at Nexora was already moving pieces, getting ahead of the narrative, making sure the transition looked clean. The bus stopped 3 blocks from his apartment building. Ethan walked the rest of the way under trees that were shedding leaves in shades of rust and gold. Mrs. Chen's apartment was on the ground floor. He could hear music coming from inside, something with a lot of quacking. He knocked. The door flew open and 62 pounds of 6-year-old enthusiasm crashed into his legs. "Daddy, I learned the duck song. Want to hear it? Mrs. Chen said I was the best in the whole class, and teacher gave me a sticker. And look, it's sparkly. And can we have spaghetti for dinner because I'm super hungry? And also I drew you a picture at school, but I left it in my cubby, so I'll bring it tomorrow. And Mia, breathe." She sucked in air dramatically. "Breathing." Ethan scooped her up, even though she was getting big for scooping. She wrapped her arms around his neck and squeezed hard enough to make his spine crack. "Thank you, Mrs. Chen," Ethan called over Mia's shoulder. The elderly woman appeared in the doorway, smiling. "She was wonderful today, and she ate all her snacks." She lowered her voice. "Everything okay? You look tired." "Long day, I'm good." Mrs. Chen studied him with the kind of eyes that had raised 3 sons and buried a husband and probably saw through every polite lie ever told. But she just nodded. "You know where I am if you need anything." I do, thanks. Ethan carried Mia up 3 flights of stairs to their apartment, a 2-bedroom with water stains on the ceiling and a radiator that clanked like it was haunted, but it was clean and safe and close to Mia's school. Okay, Duck Commander, Ethan said, setting her down in the kitchen. Spaghetti it is, but you're on garlic bread duty. Yes! Mia pumped her fist and ran to wash her hands. They cooked together, which mostly meant Ethan cooked while Mia provided commentary and occasional butter application. She told him about the duck song in exhaustive detail, about how Emma brought a hamster to show and tell, about how she'd beaten Connor at Foursquare during recess. Ethan listened to all of it, asking questions, making her laugh, storing up every detail because these moments, these ordinary, spaghetti-stained moments, were the only things that mattered. After dinner, Mia wanted to show him her interpretive duck dance. It involved a lot of flapping and waddling and falling over giggling. Ethan applauded like she'd performed at Carnegie Hall. Bath time. Story time. The elaborate bedtime routine that included exactly 3 sips of water, checking under the bed for monsters, none found, and making sure Mr. Whiskers the stuffed rabbit was properly tucked in beside her. Daddy? Mia's voice was small in the darkness, lit only by her nightlight shaped like a moon. Yeah, baby. Are you sad about something? Ethan's throat tightened. What makes you think I'm sad? You're doing your thinking face, the one where your eyebrows get all scrunchy. He smoothed his eyebrows deliberately, making her giggle. I'm not sad. I'm just thinking about work stuff. Boring adult things. Is work okay? Work is fine. Promise? Promise. Now close those eyes. Tomorrow's library day, remember? Oh yeah, she snuggled deeper into her blankets. Love you, Daddy. Love you too, Mia. More than all the stars. More than all the ducks? Way more than all the ducks. She was asleep in minutes, her breathing evening out into the soft rhythm that meant she was dreaming. Ethan stood in the doorway for a while, watching her. Then he pulled the door mostly closed and walked to the kitchen. His laptop sat on his counter, buried under mail he needed to sort. He opened it and stared at his resume document, trying to figure out how to explain a 3-year gap in technical innovation without admitting that he'd chosen being a father over being ambitious. How did you put that on paper? How did you tell potential employers that you were brilliant once, but you'd traded brilliance for being home in time to make dinner? His phone buzzed. Email this time. From Nexora's HR system. Subject: Transition documentation required. He opened it. Mr. Walker, as part of the upcoming organizational transition, please prepare comprehensive documentation of all systems, protocols, and maintenance procedures currently under your purview. This documentation should be detailed enough for incoming technical staff to assume your responsibilities without interruption. Please submit all materials by end of business Thursday. Regards, Human Resources. Ethan read it twice. Then he started laughing, quiet and bitter. They wanted him to document everything he knew. Every custom configuration, every undocumented fix, every workaround he'd built into systems that were supposed to be temporary but had become permanent because they worked. They wanted him to hand over 7 years of institutional knowledge in 3 days. He could do it. Technically. He could write it all down, every detail, every secret buried in the architecture. He could make it so clear that even the hotshot engineers from Silver Point Technology could follow the breadcrumbs. But a different thought was forming in his mind. Darker. More complicated. What if he didn't? Not sabotage. He'd never do that. But what if he documented exactly what they asked for, the maintenance procedures, the basic protocols, and left out the deeper understanding? The why behind the how? The principles that made the whole thing work? What if he let them learn the hard way what happens when you replace knowledge with credentials? Ethan closed his laptop and walked to the window. The city stretched out below, lights flickering like stars brought down to earth. Somewhere out there, in a corner office 6 floors above a basement server room, Evelyn Carter was probably working late, learning her new company, trusting the advisors around her to guide her towards smart decisions. She had no idea what she was about to lose. And Ethan realized, standing there in his quiet apartment with his daughter sleeping down the hall, that he didn't care enough to save her from it. He'd spent 7 years being invisible, being underestimated, being the guy people forgot about until something broke. Maybe it was time to let something break. Not out of revenge, not out of bitterness, but because some lessons couldn't be taught. They had to be learned through consequences. Ethan pulled out his phone and opened his message to Jerry Fisk. Typed, "I'll have the documentation ready by Thursday. Standard maintenance procedures and system protocols." 3 dots appeared. Then, "Appreciate it, Walker. I know this isn't easy. It's fine, just business." Ethan set down his phone and started making mental notes of what he would include in the documentation and what he would leave out. The difference between making something work and understanding why it worked. The space between following instructions and having wisdom. Thursday came faster than expected. Ethan spent his last 3 days documenting everything they'd asked for. He was thorough, professional. He created detailed guides on routine maintenance, emergency procedures, system restart protocols. He included diagrams and flowcharts and step-by-step instructions written clearly enough for anyone with basic technical knowledge to follow. He just didn't include the deeper truths. He didn't explain why Server Cluster D had a hidden cooling protocol that activated during heat spikes. He didn't document the thermal state memory system he'd built into the infrastructure core, the one that learned and adapted to usage patterns. He didn't mention that what looked like redundant code was actually protection against cascade failures. He gave them the map. He just left out the legend. Friday afternoon, Ethan packed his toolbox for the last time. The crayon drawing went into his jacket pocket. His few personal items fit in a canvas bag that had seen better days. He walked through the basement one final time, checking things out of habit more than duty. The servers hummed their eternal song, unaware that the person who understood them best was leaving. Jerry met him at the exit with the severance paperwork. They shook hands. Jerry looked genuinely sorry, which Ethan appreciated even though it didn't change anything. "Good luck, Walker. You land somewhere good." "Thanks, Jerry. Enjoy retirement." 18 months. I'm counting days. Ethan walked out of Nexora Systems at 4:47 p.m. on a Friday afternoon in October. The sun was already thinking about setting. The air smelled like rain that might not come. He took the bus home, picked up Mia from Mrs. Chen's, made fish sticks for dinner because it was Friday, and that was the deal. Mia chattered about her day, about the field trip next week, about the book fair where she wanted to buy something about horses. She didn't ask about work. She was 6. Work was the thing that happened before Daddy came home. That night, after Mia was asleep, Ethan sat at his kitchen table with his laptop and started applying for jobs. He had 4 weeks of severance, 60 days of benefits. He could afford to be a little selective, find something that would let him keep the balance he'd built, something that would let him stay invisible. His phone buzzed. Text from a number he didn't recognize. "Hey man, it's Carter." "Carter Reeves. Started at Nexora this week. Jerry mentioned you'd be a good resource if we had questions about the legacy systems. Mind if I reach out if we hit any snags?" Ethan stared at the message. Carter Reeves. One of the new engineers, one of the best in the industry, according to Dominic Hale. Part of the team that was supposed to modernize everything. Part of the team that had replaced him. Ethan typed back, "Sure, happy to help if I can." Because that's what you did. You were professional. You didn't burn bridges. You didn't let bitterness make you small. Even if part of you wanted to watch them stumble. Even if part of you knew they would. Ethan set his phone down and looked at the bills spread across his table. Rent due in 2 weeks. Insurance payment. Mia's school supplies. The dentist appointment he'd been putting off. He'd figure it out. He always did. Outside, the rain that had been threatening finally arrived, tapping against windows like it was asking permission to enter. Ethan listened to it while he filled out job applications, his mind half on the forms and half on the infrastructure he'd left behind, wondering how long it would take, wondering if they'd figure it out before something went wrong, wondering if, when the time came, anyone would remember the maintenance guy who'd known things he never got credit for. Probably not, but that was fine. Ethan had made his choice 3 years ago when Mia's mother died, and he'd realized that being a genius meant nothing if you missed your daughter's childhood. He'd chosen ordinary over exceptional, present over brilliant, invisible over indispensable. He'd chosen pancakes on Saturday mornings and bedtime stories and interpretive duck dances. And he'd do it again. The rain picked up, drumming harder against the glass. Somewhere across the city, in a building Ethan used to know better than his own reflection, servers continued humming through the night, running on architecture that looked simple because he'd made it work perfectly. For now. Ethan closed his laptop and went to check on Mia one more time before bed. She was tangled in her blankets, Mr. Whiskers fallen to the floor. He tucked the rabbit back beside her, smoothed hair away from her face. "Sleep tight, baby," he whispered. Then he went to his own room, set an alarm for tomorrow morning, Saturday, library day, the first weekend of the rest of whatever came next, and fell asleep to the sound of rain washing the city clean. 3 weeks after Ethan walked out of Nexora Systems for the last time, Evelyn Carter stood in her corner office watching the sun climb over a city she was still learning to navigate. Her coffee had gone cold an hour ago, forgotten beside quarterly reports that painted a picture she didn't fully trust yet. The numbers looked good. Revenue up 18%. Client retention at 94%. Infrastructure costs down after the recent team consolidation. Everything looked perfect on paper. That should have been her first warning. "Morning, Evelyn." Dominic Hale entered without knocking, carrying his own coffee and the kind of confidence that came from 20 years of making companies profitable. "Ready for the engineering update?" She turned from the window. "They're settling in okay? The new team? Better than okay. Carter, Adrian, and Isaac are exceptional. They've already identified 3 optimization opportunities that the previous staff missed entirely." Dominic set a tablet on her desk, pulling up a presentation. "See here? Redundant processes, outdated protocols, systems running inefficient loops. They're cleaning it up." Evelyn studied the slides, trying to ignore the small voice in her head that said she should understand this better. She'd built her career in business development, in client relations and strategic partnerships. The technical infrastructure was supposed to be someone else's problem. That's why you hired people like Dominic. That's why you brought in engineers from Silver Point. "What's the timeline?" she asked. "They're implementing changes in phases. First wave goes live next week. Should see immediate improvements in processing speed and reduced power consumption." Dominic smiled. "We're going to save almost $200,000 annually on cooling costs alone." "And there's no risk?" "To client systems?" "Evelyn." Dominic's voice carried gentle patience, the tone you'd use with a smart person asking unnecessary questions. "These are the best engineers money can buy. They've done this for companies twice our size. Trust the process." She wanted to. The founder who'd retired to Montana had told her during the transition to trust her instincts, but also to trust the people she surrounded herself with. Dominic had been with Nexora for 6 years. He knew the company inside and out. "Okay," Evelyn said. "Keep me updated on the implementation." "Always do." Dominic headed for the door, then paused. "Oh, one more thing. That maintenance tech we let go, Walker, he's been texting Carter asking about system access. I told Carter to ignore it. We don't need legacy thinking contaminating the new approach." Evelyn frowned. "He's asking for access?" "Just fishing, probably hoping we'll realize we made a mistake and bring him back." Dominic waved it off. "Carter's handling it professionally. Nothing to worry about." After he left, Evelyn pulled up the severance records on her computer. Ethan Walker's file was thin. 3 years as a maintenance technician, performance reviews that used words like adequate and reliable, but nothing that suggested brilliance or irreplaceability. The severance package had been standard, fair. So why did she feel uneasy? She pushed the feeling down and went back to the quarterly reports, forcing herself to focus on the things she actually understood. Across the city, in a coffee shop with Wi-Fi that barely worked, and chairs that had seen better decades, Ethan sat with his laptop open and his phone face down on the table. He'd applied to 17 positions in 3 weeks. He'd gotten 2 callbacks, 1 rejection, and 14 silences that said more than any form letter could. The job market for infrastructure engineers who'd been out of the game for 3 years was apparently not great. His phone buzzed. He flipped it over, hoping for something from the interview he'd done yesterday, but it was just Carter Reeves again. "Hey man, quick question about Server Cluster D. Documentation says to restart it using Protocol 7, but that's causing some weird lag spikes. You ever see that?" Ethan stared at the message. This was the 4th text this week. They were small questions, the kind that seemed minor until you realized they were symptoms of not understanding the underlying system. Protocol 7 was the standard restart procedure. It worked fine if you didn't mind the lag spikes, which lasted about 40 seconds and resolved themselves. Ethan had built it that way deliberately because the alternative, Protocol 12, the fast restart, bypassed certain thermal checks that were critical during high load periods. But Protocol 12 wasn't in the documentation he'd left behind. Ethan could tell Carter about it, could explain the whole thing in a paragraph, could save them the annoyance of 40-second lag spikes. Instead, he typed, "Lag spikes are normal with Protocol 7. They'll resolve on their own." He hit send before he could second-guess himself. It wasn't sabotage, it was just incomplete help. They had brilliant engineers. Surely they'd figure out the optimal solution on their own. "You want a refill?" The barista appeared beside his table, pot of coffee in hand that smelled like it had been burning since the Clinton administration. "No thanks. I'm good." She glanced at his laptop screen, at the job application form half filled. "Job hunting?" "Yeah. Tough market. My brother's been looking for 6 months." She moved to the next table. "Good luck, though." Ethan went back to his application, trying to figure out how to explain his employment gap in a way that sounded professional instead of desperate. Left previous position to focus on personal development, took time to reassess career goals, stepped back from technical leadership to prioritize work-life balance. They all sounded like excuses. His phone buzzed again. Different number this time. "Hello? Mr. Walker. This is Todd Hernandez from Pacific Systems Group. We received your application for the infrastructure analyst position. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Ethan grabbed his laptop and headed for the door, stepping out into November air that bit harder than October's had. "Yes, absolutely. Thanks for calling." The conversation lasted 20 minutes. Todd asked competent questions. Ethan gave competent answers. They danced around the employment gap without directly addressing it. Todd promised to be in touch within the week. Ethan knew what that meant. It meant thanks, but no thanks delivered in the politest possible way. He checked the time. 2:30. He needed to pick up Mia from school in an hour. Before that, he should probably eat something that wasn't coffee and anxiety. His phone buzzed. Text from Mrs. Chen. "Can you grab milk on your way home?" "I used the last of mine, making Mia hot chocolate." Ethan smiled despite everything. "No problem. Thanks for watching her this morning. Always a pleasure. She taught me 3 new duck facts today." The grocery store near Mia's school was crowded with other parents doing the same last-minute shopping. Ethan grabbed milk, then impulsively added the ingredients for pancakes. He'd promised Mia they'd make them this weekend. Might as well keep one promise while everything else fell apart. At the register, his card declined. "Can you try it again?" Ethan asked, knowing what the answer would be. The cashier swiped it twice more. "Sorry, it's not going through." Ethan pulled out a different card, the one he kept for emergencies. It went through. $37 for groceries that would last 4 days if he was careful. He checked his banking app in the parking lot. The declined card had been his checking account. He'd forgotten about the insurance payment that auto-drafted on the 1st of the month. His severance was covering expenses, but barely, and it would run out in 2 weeks. "Focus," he muttered to himself, shoving the phone back in his pocket. One thing at a time. He picked up Mia from school. She bounced into the car full of stories about art class and the hamster that Emma had brought for show and tell last week that had somehow become legendary in first-grade mythology. "And teacher said we're going to learn about the solar system next week, and I told her I already know that Jupiter has a big red spot, and she said, 'That's very good, Mia, and can we go to the library tomorrow because I want to get more books about space?'" "Absolutely," Ethan said, pulling into traffic. "Library tomorrow. It's a deal." That night, after dinner and homework and the bedtime routine, Ethan sat at his kitchen table with his laptop and forced himself to look at his finances honestly. Rent due in 12 days. Car insurance due in 8. He had $19 in checking, $400 and change in savings, and 2 weeks of severance payments left. After that, nothing. He could borrow from Mrs. Chen, maybe. She'd offered before, but she was on a fixed income herself, and Ethan had never been good at asking for help. He could sell his car, take the bus everywhere, but that would make job hunting harder, make getting Mia to school harder, make everything harder. He could ask his sister in Oregon for a loan, but they hadn't spoken in 2 years after she'd suggested that maybe Mia would be better off with someone more stable, someone who wasn't barely holding it together. Ethan closed the laptop harder than necessary. His phone lit up. Another text from Carter. Documentation mentions thermal monitoring but doesn't specify parameters. What's the normal operating range for the core systems? Ethan read it twice. They were implementing their optimization changes next week, according to Dominic's timeline. Making adjustments to systems they didn't fully understand based on documentation that gave them procedures but not principles. This was going to be a disaster. He could stop it, could call Evelyn Carter directly, explain who he actually was, lay out the dangers of what they were about to do. But why would she believe him? A fired maintenance tech claiming he was actually the architect of systems that had been running for 7 years? It sounded like desperation, like someone trying to make themselves important after being deemed expendable. And maybe there was a darker part of him that wanted to see what happened when confident people learned they weren't as smart as they thought. Ethan typed back, "Normal range is 68 to 72 degrees Celsius. Anything above 75 needs attention." It was true, just not complete. The core systems had adaptive thermal management that adjusted based on load patterns. They could safely run hotter during certain operations, could throttle themselves down during others. But explaining that required explaining the whole architecture, and Ethan was tired of giving away knowledge he'd never gotten credit for. The next week passed in a blur of job applications that went nowhere, and interviews that felt like auditions for a role Ethan was no longer sure he wanted. Every position was the same. Someone younger looking at his resume with polite skepticism, asking subtle questions about why he'd stepped back from advancement, whether he was really committed to getting back into serious technical work. By Thursday, Ethan had a new routine. Wake up at 6:30, make Mia breakfast, drop her at school, spend the day applying for jobs and trying not to spiral into panic about money, pick up Mia, help with homework, make dinner, bedtime. Then hours at his laptop searching for opportunities that didn't exist. His phone buzzed less frequently now. Carter had stopped asking questions, which probably meant they'd either figured things out or decided Ethan wasn't helpful enough to bother. Friday afternoon, Ethan was making grilled cheese when his phone rang. Unknown number, but he answered it anyway because he had to. "Is this Ethan Walker?" "Speaking." "Mr. Walker, this is Jennifer Park from Dataline Industries. We'd like to invite you for a second interview. Would you be available next Tuesday at 2? Ethan's hand tightened on the phone. "Yes, absolutely. Tuesday at 2 works perfectly." "Excellent. I'll send you the details via email. We're looking forward to speaking with you." After she hung up, Ethan stood in his kitchen staring at nothing, feeling something that might have been hope trying to break through the layers of stress he'd been carrying. A second interview, at a company that actually seemed interested. At a position that paid enough to cover rent and insurance and maybe even let him breathe a little. "Daddy, the pan is smoking." Ethan jerked back to reality. The grilled cheese was burning. He flipped it quickly, managed to save it before it crossed from toasted to charcoal. "Crisis averted," he said, sliding the sandwich onto Mia's plate. She looked at it skeptically. "It's got black spots." "Those are flavor spots, very fancy." "I don't think that's real." "Eat your fancy sandwich, kid." She ate it, black spots and all, while telling him about the substitute teacher they'd had today, who didn't know the rules for quiet reading time and let everyone talk, which was basically the best day ever in first-grade terms. That night, Ethan let himself feel something close to optimistic. He had a second interview. He had a week and a half before rent was due. He could make this work. Across the city, in Nexora's server room, 3 engineers from Silver Point Technology were implementing the first phase of their optimization plan. Carter Reeves pulled up the monitoring dashboard on his tablet, watching system loads redistribute according to their new configurations. "Okay, bringing Cluster D online with the updated parameters." Adrian Moss, 34 and carrying credentials from MYT, nodded from his position at the backup terminal. "Load balancing looks good. Processing speeds up by 12% already." Isaac Park, the youngest at 28 but possibly the smartest person Carter had ever worked with, was running diagnostics on the thermal management systems. Temperatures holding steady, 70 degrees across the board. Perfect. Carter initiated the sequence they'd spent 2 weeks planning. Lines of code executed flawlessly. Systems that had been running the same way for years suddenly shifted into new patterns, optimized for efficiency instead of whatever legacy thinking had designed them. For the first hour, everything worked beautifully. The monitoring system showed exactly what they'd predicted: faster processing, lower power consumption, better resource allocation. Dominic Hale sent a congratulatory email from his phone. Evelyn Carter got a briefing that made her smile for the first time in a week. By hour 3, small anomalies started appearing in the logs. Nothing catastrophic, just tiny spikes in temperature that resolved themselves. Brief lag moments that disappeared before anyone noticed. The kind of minor irregularities that every system experienced and that experienced engineers knew to monitor but not panic over. "You seen these?" Isaac asked, highlighting a cluster of alerts on his screen. Carter pulled up the same data. "Yeah, probably just the system adapting to the new configuration. We changed a lot of fundamental processes. There's going to be some adjustment period. Should we roll back? And tell Dominic we couldn't handle a few temperature spikes?" Carter shook his head. "No, we monitor it. If it gets worse, we adjust. That's why we're doing this in phases." Adrian was already pulling up the documentation Walker had left behind. "The thermal protocols say to maintain range between 68 and 72 degrees. We're well within that. Then we're fine. Keep watching it, but I'm not seeing anything that justifies hitting the panic button." The spikes continued throughout the weekend, small enough to ignore, frequent enough to be annoying. By Monday morning, they'd established a pattern. Brief temperature increases during high load periods, followed by slower than optimal cooling cycles. Carter sent a text to the number he'd been messaging before. "Hey Walker, seeing some thermal cycling issues after system updates. Normal or something to worry about?" The response came an hour later. "Probably normal. Systems adjust to configuration changes. Give it a few days." Carter showed the message to Isaac. "See? Even the old maintenance guy says we're fine." "The old maintenance guy who got fired and might not actually want to help us," Isaac pointed out. "He's been answering my questions for weeks. Why would he start sabotaging now?" Isaac didn't have an answer for that, so they went back to monitoring, watching the numbers fluctuate in ways that were annoying but not alarming. On Tuesday afternoon, while Ethan sat in a conference room at Dataline Industries answering questions about infrastructure scalability and disaster recovery protocols, Nexora's core systems experienced their first significant fault. It lasted 8 seconds, a brief cascade where Cluster D's temperature spiked to 79 degrees before the automated systems brought it back down. 8 seconds wasn't long enough to cause damage, but it was long enough to trigger automated alerts that pinged to every engineer's phone simultaneously. Carter, Adrian, and Isaac converged in the server room within minutes. "What happened?" Evelyn appeared in the doorway, Dominic right behind her. "Minor fault," Carter said, already pulling up diagnostic logs. "Temperature spike in Cluster D. The system corrected itself, but we're investigating the cause." "Is this related to your optimization?" Evelyn's voice was sharp. "Possibly, but every major system update comes with adjustment periods. This is normal." Carter kept his voice confident, even though his hands were sweating. "We're already implementing additional monitoring protocols." Dominic put a hand on Evelyn's shoulder, steering her back toward the door. "Let them work. This is exactly why we have the best engineers money can buy." After they left, Isaac pulled Carter aside. "That wasn't normal. That was a cascade pattern. Like the system lost track of its thermal state and had to reset." "Systems don't have thermal states, they have operating parameters. This one might be different." Carter wanted to argue, but the logs were showing something he didn't fully understand. Patterns that didn't match anything in the documentation. Behaviors that suggested the infrastructure was more complex than it appeared on the surface. He pulled out his phone and texted Walker again. Had an 8-second cascade event. Cluster D spiked to 79 degrees Celsius before auto-correction. Documentation doesn't cover this scenario. Advice? The response took longer this time. Long enough that Carter started drafting a different message to a former colleague at Silverpoint who might have ideas. Then his phone buzzed. That's the thermal state memory resetting. It'll happen a few times as the system relearns parameters. Should stabilize. Carter read it twice. Thermal state memory? What the hell is that? Adrian looked up from his terminal. Not in any documentation I've seen. Google it. They spent 20 minutes searching technical databases and finding nothing. Thermal state memory wasn't a standard term. It wasn't in any textbook or industry documentation they could access, which meant either Walker was making it up or Nexora's infrastructure had custom architecture that wasn't documented anywhere. Call him, Isaac said. Actually, call him and get him to explain what that means. Carter pulled up Walker's contact information. The number he'd been texting was the only one listed. He hit call. It rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. Generic automated voice saying the subscriber wasn't available. Great, Carter muttered. He tried again, same result. At that exact moment, Ethan was sitting in his car outside Mia's school, staring at his phone and watching it ring. Carter Reeves calling. Probably panicking about the Cascade event that Ethan had known was coming since the moment they started implementing changes. He could answer, could explain everything, could probably even get his job back if he played this right. But the interview at Dataline had gone well. Really well. They'd practically offered him the position on the spot, pending background checks and reference calls. It was a good job. Stable. Better pay than Nexora had ever given him. And it came with the freedom of starting fresh somewhere that didn't have 7 years of invisible history. Ethan let the call go to voicemail. Then he got out of his car and went to pick up his daughter from school, because that was the promise that mattered more than anything happening in a server room across town. The Cascade events continued over the next 2 days. Small ones, mostly. Temperature spikes that auto-corrected within seconds. But they were getting more frequent, and the correction times were getting longer. By Thursday, Evelyn called an emergency meeting. "Explain to me why our infrastructure is becoming less stable instead of more stable," she said, standing at the head of the conference table with her arms crossed. Carter, Adrian, and Isaac sat on one side. Dominic sat on the other, looking like someone who just discovered his careful planning had hit an unexpected obstacle. "We're experiencing adjustment irregularities," Carter began. "The system is adapting to I don't want corporate speak. I want the truth. Are we in danger of a serious failure?" The 3 engineers exchanged glances. Finally, Isaac spoke up. "There's architecture in this infrastructure that isn't documented, custom systems we didn't know existed. We're trying to reverse engineer the logic, but without documentation." "Who built these systems?" Evelyn demanded. "We're not sure. The documentation Walker left doesn't include original architecture diagrams, just maintenance procedures." Evelyn turned to Dominic. "Get Walker on the phone, now." "Evelyn, I don't think—" "Now, Dominic." Dominic pulled out his phone, looking irritated. He dialed, waited, then shook his head. "Voicemail." "Try again." 3 more attempts. 3 more voicemails. "He's not answering," Dominic said. And frankly, even if he did, what could a maintenance technician tell us that these 3 couldn't figure out? "Apparently quite a lot," Evelyn snapped. She turned back to Carter. "How bad can this get?" "Worst case? Total system failure. But we're nowhere near that. We're implementing safeguards, adding redundancy, monitoring everything in real time. We'll get ahead of it." "When?" "End of next week, we should have stability restored." Evelyn looked at each of them in turn. "You have until end of next week. If we're not stable by then, we're rolling back every change you made and figuring out Plan B." After the meeting, Dominic found Carter in the hallway. "Don't worry about Evelyn. She's new. She's nervous. This is exactly the kind of challenge that makes good engineers great. You'll solve it." "What if we can't?" Carter asked quietly. "What if this infrastructure is more complex than we understood? Then you figure it out anyway. That's why we hired you." Dominic clapped him on the shoulder. "Have confidence. You're the best in the industry." Carter wanted to believe that. He'd spent his entire career being the best, solving impossible problems, building systems that other people couldn't. But standing in that hallway, watching Dominic walk away with absolute confidence in a situation he didn't understand, Carter felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt scared. The heat wave hit the city on a Wednesday morning in late November, the kind of unseasonable weather that made meteorologists scramble for explanations and everyone else peel off layers they'd put on out of habit. By noon, temperatures had climbed to 89 degrees, and the National Weather Service was issuing warnings about strain on electrical grids. Inside Nexora Systems, the air conditioning was fighting a losing battle. Carter stood in server room B watching temperature readings climb on his tablet, feeling sweat collect under his collar despite the industrial cooling units running at maximum capacity. 73 degrees, 74, 75. "We need to throttle back the processing loads," Adrian said from his position at the environmental controls. "Redistribute to the backup facility in Portland. Already maxed out. They're dealing with the same heat wave." Isaac was pulling up weather patterns on his screen, looking for any indication this would break soon. Forecast says 3 more days of this. Carter made the call he'd been dreading. I'm implementing Protocol 12. Fast restart on Cluster D to clear the thermal buildup. That's not in the documentation, Isaac said. Walker mentioned it in a text 2 weeks ago, said it was for emergency cooling situations. He also said Protocol 7 was standard. How do we know Protocol 12 is safe? Because we don't have a choice. Look at those numbers. The temperature had hit 77 degrees. Warning alerts were lighting up across every monitoring system. In another minute, they'd trigger automatic shutdowns that would take down half their client services. Carter entered the command sequence for Protocol 12. For exactly 8 seconds, it worked perfectly. Processing loads dropped, temperatures began falling, every indicator showed the system responding exactly as designed. Then something deep in the infrastructure detected an anomaly. The cascade started in Cluster D, specifically in a subsystem that the optimization team had flagged as redundant code 3 weeks ago. A thermal state memory loop that seemed to serve no purpose, that appeared to be legacy architecture from an earlier, less efficient design. They'd removed it during the cleanup phase, patting themselves on the backs for streamlining the system. Except it hadn't been redundant. It had been protection. Without that loop, the fast restart protocol had no way to verify thermal states across dependent systems. It couldn't confirm that Cluster C had finished its cooling cycle before Cluster D came back online. Couldn't check that the backup arrays were ready to handle redistributed loads. Couldn't validate any of the dozens of interconnected processes that Ethan had designed to work together like instruments in an orchestra. The system tried to compensate. Automated protocols kicked in, attempting to restore balance, to find the missing logic that should have been there. But you can't compensate for something you don't know exists. At 12:47 p.m., Cluster D went into a full failure loop. Carter watched it happen on his screen with the kind of horror that comes from understanding something terrible just as it becomes unfixable. Temperature readings spiked to 86 degrees in 3 seconds. Error logs filled faster than the monitoring system could display them. And then, like dominoes falling in slow motion, every connected cluster began experiencing the same cascade. "Shut it down!" Carter yelled. "Emergency shutdown, everything!" Adrian was already hitting the kill switches, but the system wasn't responding to manual overrides. It was locked in its failure loop, trying desperately to find logic that no longer existed, burning itself out in the attempt. Isaac grabbed his phone. "I'm calling the backup facility. If we can shift loads before—" The lights in the server room flickered, then died completely. Emergency lighting kicked in 3 seconds later, bathing everything in red that made the whole scene feel like a nightmare instead of a technical failure. "No, no, 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 no!" Carter was typing commands into his tablet, even though he knew it was pointless. The system had gone beyond cascade. It had reached critical failure, the kind of collapse that couldn't be fixed with commands or protocols or brilliant engineering. Somewhere 6 floors above them, Evelyn Carter's computer screen went black in the middle of a video call with Nexora's largest client. In the operations center, monitoring stations that tracked 47 enterprise accounts watched those accounts go offline one by one, like stars winking out. The silence in the server room was wrong. After years of working in environments filled with the constant hum of machines, the absence of that sound felt like standing in a graveyard. "How bad is this?" Adrian's voice was quiet. Carter couldn't answer. He was staring at his tablet, at the cascade of error messages that told a story he didn't want to read. Total infrastructure failure. Every cluster offline. Thermal damage to hardware that would take days to assess. Client data secure but completely inaccessible. His phone rang. Dominic Hale. Carter answered. "We have a situation." "I know you have a situation. I'm looking at 47 enterprise clients who just went dark. Please tell me you have a solution." "We're working on it." "That's not an answer, Carter. How long until systems are back online?" Carter looked at Isaac and Adrian, saw his own panic reflected in their faces. "I don't know." "Find out. Evelyn's on her way down there now." The call ended. Carter stood there holding his phone, feeling the weight of his entire career collapsing around him. He was supposed to be the best, the engineer that companies headhunted from Silver Point Technology, the guy who solved impossible problems. But he'd never seen anything like this. "We need to figure out what happened," Isaac said, already pulling up backup logs on his laptop. Trace the cascade back to the trigger point. They worked in silence for 10 minutes, following the failure path backward through layers of code and protocols. The red emergency lighting made everything harder to read, turned simple diagnostics into eye-straining puzzles. Adrian found it first. Here, the thermal state memory loop, the one we removed 3 weeks ago during optimization. That was redundant code, Carter said, but his voice lacked conviction. Apparently it wasn't. Adrian pulled up the original system architecture, the parts they'd had access to. Look at this. It's referenced in 17 different subsystems, not documented anywhere, just woven into the infrastructure like it's load-bearing. Carter felt something cold settle in his stomach. Who designed this? I don't know. The architecture documentation doesn't have authorship records. The server room door slammed open. Evelyn strode in with Dominic right behind her, both of them looking like people trying very hard not to scream. Tell me what happened, Evelyn said. No preamble, no corporate politeness, just barely controlled fury. Carter stood up straight, forced himself to meet her eyes. We experienced a catastrophic cascade failure triggered by thermal overload during the heat wave. The system attempted to compensate but encountered missing architecture that we'd removed during optimization. You removed critical infrastructure? We removed what appeared to be redundant code. It wasn't documented as critical. It wasn't documented at all. And now we're offline. Every cluster, every client, total system failure. Evelyn's jaw tightened. How long to restore? This was the question Carter had been dreading, the answer he didn't want to give. I don't know. The system architecture is more complex than we understood. There are dependencies and integrations that aren't in any documentation. We're essentially reverse engineering it while it's broken. Best guess. Days, maybe a week, maybe longer. The silence that followed was the kind that preceded very bad decisions. Carter could see Evelyn running calculations in her head, figuring out how much money they were losing every minute, how many clients they were about to lose permanently. Get Walker on the phone, she said finally. We've been trying. He's not answering. Then find him. I don't care if you have to drive to his house. Find him and get him here. Dominic stepped forward. Evelyn, Walker was a maintenance technician. What makes you think he can fix something these three can't? Because these three just broke it. Evelyn's voice was ice. And because right now I'm willing to try anything that might get my company back online before we lose everything. She turned and walked out, leaving Dominic to give Carter an apologetic look that didn't help at all. After they left, Isaac pulled up employee records on his laptop. Walker, Ethan, terminated 6 weeks ago. Last known address is here, apartment in the Riverside district. You think he'll help us? Adrian asked. We literally replaced him. I think we're about to find out. Carter grabbed his jacket. Isaac, you're with me. Adrian, stay here and keep trying to stabilize what you can. The drive across town took 30 minutes through traffic that had gotten worse as the heat wave made everyone irritable. Carter spent the whole time rehearsing what he'd say, trying to figure out how you ask someone you'd replace to save you from your own mistakes. Walker's apartment building was older, the kind of place that had probably been nice in the 70s and now just looked tired. 3rd floor, unit 312. Carter knocked, waited, knocked again. A woman opened the door in the apartment next to Walker's. Elderly, Chinese, wearing an apron that smelled like ginger. He's not home. Picking up his daughter from school. Do you know when he'll be back? Half an hour, maybe? Can I give him a message? Carter hesitated. Just tell him people from Nexora need to talk to him. It's urgent. The woman's expression shifted to something knowing. You're the ones who fired him. Yes, ma'am. And now you need his help. It wasn't a question, but Carter answered anyway. Yes, ma'am. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I'll tell him you came by, but if I were you, I'd prepare a better apology than whatever you're currently planning. Back in the car, Isaac was pulling up everything he could find about Ethan Walker online. It wasn't much. No social media presence, no professional networking profiles, a few old technical forum posts from 7 years ago, answering complex infrastructure questions with the kind of expertise that made Carter's stomach sink further. He knew what he was talking about, Isaac said, showing Carter a post where Walker had explained thermal management in distributed systems. This is advanced stuff, way beyond maintenance technician level. Carter's phone rang. Evelyn. Status? We're at Walker's apartment. He's not home yet. Neighbor says he'll be back in 30 minutes. You're waiting for him? Yes. Call me the second you make contact. She hung up. Carter and Isaac sat in the car watching the building entrance, waiting for a man they'd never bothered to meet properly when he was their colleague. 27 minutes later, a beat-up Honda pulled into a parking spot 3 cars down. Ethan Walker got out, then opened the back door and helped a little girl out of her car seat. She was talking a mile a minute about something, waving her hands enthusiastically. Ethan was listening with the kind of attention that told Carter this was a man who'd prioritize different things than career advancement. Carter and Isaac got out of their car. Ethan saw them immediately. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, became more guarded. Mr. Walker, Carter approached slowly. I'm Carter Reeves. We've been texting. This is Isaac Park. We're from... I know where you're from. Ethan's hand moved to his daughter's shoulder, protective. What do you want? We need to talk to you about Nexora's infrastructure. There's been a situation. Mia was looking up at them with open curiosity. Daddy, who are these people? Work people, sweetheart. Why don't you go up to Mrs. Chen's apartment? I'll be there in a minute. But you promised we'd make cookies today. We will. I promise. Just give me 5 minutes. Mia looked skeptical, but she headed for the building entrance. Ethan waited until she was inside before turning back to Carter and Isaac. Let me guess. The system collapsed. Carter felt like he'd been punched. How did you know? Because you removed the thermal state memory loop during your optimization. And today's heat wave pushed the infrastructure past the point where that missing protection became critical. Ethan's voice was calm, matter of fact. I'd estimate you went into Cascade around 12:45, full failure by 1 o'clock. Am I close? 12:47, Isaac said quietly. How did you, I designed that infrastructure, every piece of it, 7 years ago when this company was operating out of a warehouse and couldn't afford to fail. Ethan looked at Carter directly. The thermal state memory wasn't redundant. It was the foundation that everything else was built on. Why wasn't it documented? It was. In the original architecture specifications that I submitted when I was hired as a contractor. Files that apparently got lost sometime between then and now. Ethan shrugged. Or maybe just forgotten. Happens when you're invisible long enough. Carter didn't know what to say. Every assumption he'd made, every confident assertion about legacy systems and optimization, suddenly felt like arrogance built on ignorance. We need your help, he said finally. The whole system is down. 47 clients offline. We don't know how to fix it. You're the best engineers money can buy. I'm sure you'll figure it out. Mr. Walker, please. Carter struggled to find words. I'm sorry. For not asking questions. For assuming I understood systems I didn't build. For treating you like you weren't important. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. You're sorry because you need something, not because you did something wrong. Both. I'm sorry for both. Above them, Carter could see a little girl's face pressed against a third-floor window, watching. That must be Walker's daughter. The reason he'd chosen maintenance over architecture, predictable hours over career advancement. I can't help you, Ethan said finally. I start a new job Monday. I have a daughter who needs stability. I'm done with Nexora. They'll pay you, whatever you want. Consultant rates, full authority, anything. It's not about money. Then what is it about? Ethan looked at him like he was a particularly slow student. It's about the fact that I spent 3 years being invisible because that's what I needed for my daughter. And you people fired me anyway. Replaced me with engineers who assumed they were smarter because they had better credentials. He started walking toward the building. Good luck fixing it. I genuinely hope you do. Wait. Isaac spoke up for the first time. What if we can't? What if those 47 companies lose everything because we were too arrogant to understand what we inherited? Ethan stopped walking. I have friends who work at 3 of those companies, Isaac continued. People whose jobs depend on their systems staying online, who didn't do anything wrong except trust Nexora to be competent. He paused. I'm not asking you to help us. We don't deserve it. I'm asking you to help them. The silence stretched out. Carter could hear traffic from the main road, hear wind moving through trees that were still losing leaves despite the unseasonable heat. Does Evelyn Carter even know who I am? Ethan asked. Your CEO. Does she know she fired the person who built what she's in charge of? No, Carter admitted. She thinks you were maintenance. Perfect. Ethan laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Tell her to call me herself, not Dominic, not you, her. If she wants my help, she asks for it personally. He walked into the building without looking back. Carter and Isaac stood there in the parking lot, feeling like they'd just failed a test they hadn't known they were taking. What do we tell Evelyn? Isaac asked. The truth, that we screwed up worse than we thought. The drive back to Nexora felt longer than the drive out. Carter called Evelyn from the car, explained the conversation, watched her carefully constructed professional demeanor crack over the phone. He designed the infrastructure, the entire infrastructure? 7 years ago, as a contractor. Somehow, nobody remembered, or nobody who remembered is still there. And now he won't help us unless I call him personally. That's what he said. Carter heard her take a deep breath, the kind people take before jumping off cliffs. Send me his number. At 4:17 p.m., Ethan's phone rang. He was in Mrs. Chen's kitchen helping Mia measure flour for cookies while the elderly woman supervised and offered commentary on his measuring technique. Unknown number. Ethan almost didn't answer, but something made him check the caller ID first. The number had a Nexora prefix. Mia, keep measuring. I need to take this. He stepped into the hallway. This is Ethan. Mr. Walker, this is Evelyn Carter, CEO of Nexora Systems. Her voice was professional, but strained. I understand I owe you an apology, and a very big favor. You owe me an apology. The favor is optional. Carter and Isaac explained the situation, that you designed our infrastructure and we failed to recognize that when we restructured the team. Failed to recognize it, that's one way to put it. I won't make excuses. We made a mistake, a catastrophic one. And now I'm asking, personally, not as your former employer, if you'd be willing to help us fix it. Ethan looked through the kitchen door at Mia, who was concentrating very hard on leveling off her measuring cup. I have a daughter who's been through enough chaos. I need stability, Ms. Carter, not corporate drama. I understand that. I'm not asking you to come back permanently, just to help us restore the system. Consultant contract, name your rate, work your own hours, whatever you need. Why should I believe anything will be different? Because I'm going to make sure everyone in this company knows exactly who you are and what you built. Because I'm going to personally review every piece of documentation to understand how we got to a place where critical knowledge was this invisible. And because, she paused, because I'm genuinely sorry. Not just because we need you, because we should have known better. Ethan was quiet, thinking. The cookies could wait. Mia would understand if he had to work late for a few days. Mrs. Chen would help. But that wasn't the question. The question was whether he wanted to walk back into a building where he'd been invisible, where he'd been dismissed, where people had looked through him for 3 years. I want full access, he said finally. Complete authority over the restoration process. No oversight from Dominic Hale. No second guessing from your new engineers. If I'm fixing this, I'm doing it my way. Done. And I want it in writing that I'm there as a consultant, not an employee. When this is fixed, I walk away clean. I'll have contracts ready when you arrive. When do you need me? Now would be ideal, but I understand if... Give me an hour. I need to arrange childcare and explain to my daughter why I'm breaking a promise about cookies. Thank you, Mr. Walker. Don't thank me yet. You haven't seen how bad this actually is. He hung up and went back into the kitchen. Mia looked up from her measuring, flour on her nose. Was that work? Yeah, baby. They need my help with something important. But cookies. I know. I'm sorry. We'll make them this weekend. Double batch. She considered this. Triple batch? You drive a hard bargain. Triple batch. Deal? Deal. She held out her tiny hand and they shook solemnly. Mrs. Chen was already nodding. I'll keep her tonight. You do what you need to do. Ethan changed into different clothes, kissed his daughter goodbye, and drove across town toward a building he'd thought he was done with forever. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange that looked angry. The heat wave was supposed to break tonight, storms moving in from the coast. He parked in visitor parking since his employee badge had been deactivated 6 weeks ago. Walked through a lobby where Marcus the night security guard did a double take. Walker? Thought you got laid off. Borrowed, not bought back. The elevator ride up felt like traveling backward through time. When the doors opened on the 6th floor, Evelyn Carter was waiting. She was younger than he'd expected, 30 at most, wearing a suit that probably cost more than his car payment, but looked rumpled now, like she'd been wearing it too long under too much stress. "Mr. Walker, thank you for coming. Where's the damage?" "Server room B. My team is waiting." She led him through hallways that felt different now that he was visible. People looked at him. Not through him, but at him. Word had spread fast. The server room was still bathed in red emergency lighting. Carter, Adrian, and Isaac stood near the monitoring stations, looking like soldiers who'd survived a battle but lost the war. Ethan walked past them without acknowledgement and went straight to the main terminal. It took him 30 seconds to assess the damage, another 2 minutes to understand the full scope of the failure. Then he turned to face the room. Evelyn, Dominic, who'd appeared from somewhere, the 3 engineers who'd replaced him. "Okay," Ethan said quietly. "Here's the situation. Your optimization removed critical architecture that the system needs to maintain thermal state across all clusters. Without that architecture, the fast restart protocol couldn't verify safety conditions. The cascade that followed damaged hardware in clusters D, E, and F. You've got corrupted data stores in the backup arrays, and your automated recovery systems are in failure loops because they're looking for logic that doesn't exist anymore." "Can you fix it?" Evelyn asked. "Yes, but not the way you want me to." "What does that mean?" "It means we can't just restore from backups and hope for the best. The thermal state memory has to be rebuilt from scratch. Every cluster has to be manually reinitialized in sequence. It's going to take hours of work, and it's going to require me to walk your engineers through processes they've never seen before." Ethan looked at Carter. "Processes that weren't in the documentation I left because they were designed to never be necessary." "How long?" Dominic asked. "If we start now and work through the night, system could be stable by morning, full restoration by tomorrow afternoon." "Then let's start now." Ethan pulled off his jacket, revealing the same worn flannel shirt he'd been wearing when he left this building 6 weeks ago. "Someone get me coffee and access to the infrastructure admin panel, and clear everyone out who doesn't need to be here. This isn't a spectator sport." Evelyn nodded. "Dominic, you're with me. Carter, Adrian, Isaac, you 3 stay and help however Mr. Walker needs." After they left, Ethan sat down at the terminal and started typing. His fingers remembered the commands, the sequences, the architecture he'd built when he was 25 and brilliant, and didn't know that brilliance mattered less than visibility. "Okay," he said without looking up. "Someone tell me which cluster failed first and exactly what commands you executed in the 30 seconds before everything went to hell." Carter stepped forward. "Cluster D. I implemented Protocol 12 to address thermal overload during the heat wave." "Protocol 12?" Ethan's voice was flat. "The emergency protocol I specifically said to only use if you fully understood the thermal state dependencies." "You didn't explain those dependencies." "No, I didn't." Ethan finally looked at him. "Because explaining them would have required explaining the entire architecture, and nobody asked me to do that. They just asked for maintenance procedures." The silence in the room was heavy with things unsaid. Then Ethan went back to his terminal. "All right, here's what we're going to do. Isaac, you're going to manually restart Cluster A using this specific sequence. Adrian, you're monitoring thermal loads across all systems and calling out any anomalies. Carter, you're documenting every single step we take because this time we're writing down the why, not just the how." They worked. The coffee arrived 20 minutes later, brought by someone from the night shift who looked at Ethan like he was a ghost. Ethan didn't look up from his screen, just grabbed the cup and took a drink that burned his tongue but helped him focus. "Cluster A restart sequence initiating," Isaac called out from his station. "Following your protocol exactly." Ethan watched the monitoring displays, seeing patterns emerge that he'd designed 7 years ago. Watching them come back to life felt strange, like hearing a song he'd written being performed by someone else. The notes were right, but the interpretation was different. "Temperature holding at 68 degrees, Adrian reported. No anomalies." "Good. Now we wait 30 seconds for the thermal state to stabilize before we touch anything else." Ethan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. The red emergency lighting was giving him a headache. "Carter, are you writing this down?" "Every word." Carter's fingers were moving across his laptop keyboard. But I don't understand why we're waiting 30 seconds specifically. Because the thermal state memory needs time to reestablish baseline parameters. It's like waking up from sleep. You don't immediately start running. You orient yourself first. Ethan glanced at the clock on the wall. 6:47 p.m. The system is doing the same thing. It's checking its surroundings, confirming what's safe, what's not. But there's no code for that in the architecture we reviewed, Isaac said. Yes, there is. You just didn't recognize it because it doesn't look like traditional state management. I built it into the thermal monitoring loops themselves. The system learns its own patterns over time. Carter stopped typing. You built machine learning into infrastructure cooling systems 7 years ago? I built adaptive systems. Whether you want to call it machine learning is semantics. Ethan checked his display. 30 seconds. Isaac, initialize cluster B using the same sequence. They moved through the clusters one by one, each restart taking longer than the last because the systems had to relearn how to talk to each other. Ethan walked the 3 engineers through each step, explaining principles he'd never had to articulate before because he'd always just known them. Around 8:30 p.m., Evelyn appeared in the doorway with sandwiches from somewhere. Thought you might be hungry. Ethan took one without looking away from his screen. Turkey and something. He ate it mechanically, fueling the body that was trying to rebuild what these people had broken. How's it going? Evelyn asked. We're at 50% restoration, another 4 hours minimum. She nodded, started to leave, then paused. Can I ask you something? You're paying consultant rates. You can ask whatever you want. Why didn't you ever tell anyone that you built all this? Ethan finally looked at her. I did tell people 7 years ago, but the people I told either left or forgot, and nobody thought to check the original documentation. After a while, it was easier to just let it go. That must have been frustrating. It was what it was. Ethan turned back to his screen. I had other priorities. Evelyn left them alone. The night stretched on, measured in cluster restarts and thermal readings and coffee that got progressively worse as the pot sat too long on the burner. Around 11 p.m., Adrian made a mistake. He initiated a restart sequence 4 seconds too early before the thermal state had fully stabilized. Ethan caught it immediately, killed the command before it could execute. What did I do wrong? Adrian asked, looking panicked. You rushed it. This indicator showed green, but green just means acceptable. We need optimal. Ethan pulled up the thermal readout, showed him the subtle difference in the curves. See this? Temperature's still fluctuating by 0.3 degrees. Tiny variance, but enough to cause problems if we build on top of it. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. Learn. Ethan reset the sequence. Try again, but this time watch the variance, not just the absolute number. Adrian did it correctly the second time. Ethan nodded approval and moved on. By 1 a.m., they had all clusters online except Cluster F, which had sustained the worst hardware damage. Ethan was on his 3rd win now, past exhaustion into that strange clarity that comes from being too tired to second-guess yourself. Cluster F is different, he said, mostly to himself. The thermal damage corrupted the state memory completely. We can't restart it using normal protocols. So what do we do? Carter asked. We rebuild the state memory manually. Tell the system what it should know instead of letting it relearn. How long will that take? Ethan looked at the diagnostic reports, at the extent of the damage. 2 hours, maybe 3. Isaac checked his phone. I need to call my wife. Tell her I won't be home tonight. Make it quick, Ethan said. I'm going to need you walking through the memory reconstruction with me. While Isaac stepped out to call home, Ethan pulled up the core architecture files he'd created 7 years ago. Files that hadn't been opened since he'd submitted them as a contractor, that had been sitting in a backup directory nobody thought to check. Looking at his younger self's code was disorienting. He'd been so confident then, so sure that elegant solutions would speak for themselves. He'd built in redundancies and protections and adaptive systems because that's what good architecture required, not because he thought he'd need to explain them to people who'd eventually remove them. Your code is beautiful, Adrian said quietly, looking over his shoulder. I mean that. It's genuinely elegant. It's functional, Ethan corrected. Beautiful code that doesn't work is just art. This was always supposed to work. It did work, for 7 years without a major failure. until someone removed the protections that made it work. Ethan didn't say it meanly, just factually. That's the difference between understanding code and understanding systems. Code is what you write. Systems are what you build. Isaac came back looking exhausted. My wife says hi and wants to know if you're hiring tutors to explain complex engineering to people who should already know it. Despite everything, Ethan almost smiled. Tell her I'm freelance. They dove into Cluster F's reconstruction. This was the delicate part, the work that couldn't be rushed or automated. Ethan had to manually input thermal state parameters for every subsystem, creating a baseline that the cluster could build on. Carter watched him work with the kind of attention that suggested he was finally understanding what he'd missed. This isn't just engineering, this is craftsmanship. It's both, Ethan said. Engineering is understanding principles. Craftsmanship is applying them with care. His fingers kept moving across the keyboard, entering values from memory that he hadn't accessed in years. Anyone can build something that works. Building something that works reliably, that fails gracefully, that can be fixed by people who didn't build it, that takes craftsmanship. But we couldn't fix it, Adrian pointed out, even with documentation. Because I didn't document the craftsmanship, just the engineering. Ethan paused, considering. That was my mistake. I assumed anyone maintaining it would understand why it was built the way it was. I didn't account for people coming in later who'd only see what was there, not why it needed to be there. The admission hung in the air. Not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement that maybe everyone involved had failed to communicate something important. At 3:17 a.m., Cluster F came back online. The monitoring systems showed green across every display. All clusters operational, thermal state stable. The infrastructure was breathing again, humming the familiar song that Ethan had fallen asleep to countless nights when he'd worked here. We're live, Isaac said, sounding like he couldn't quite believe it. Not yet. Ethan was pulling up client connection protocols. We're stable. Now we need to reconnect the 47 enterprise accounts without overwhelming the system. How do we do that? Carefully. Ethan started entering commands. We bring them back in waves, smallest accounts first, let the system adjust to the load, then gradually add the larger ones. He walked them through the reconnection sequence, explaining load balancing and priority queuing, and all the invisible decisions that made a system robust instead of just functional. One by one, the enterprise accounts came back online. Somewhere in the building, monitoring stations were lighting up with confirmation signals. Client services being restored. Data access returning. The catastrophic failure becoming a catastrophic recovery. By 4:30 a.m., they were done. Ethan leaned back in his chair, every muscle in his body aching. He'd been awake for 22 hours, had rebuilt an entire infrastructure from near-total collapse, had taught 3 brilliant engineers things they should have learned before they started changing systems they didn't understand. Is that it? Carter asked. We're really back? You're back. I'm going home. Ethan stood up, his back protesting. You'll want to monitor everything closely for the next 48 hours. Watch for any irregular patterns. I'll send you documentation of what we did tonight, including the why behind every step. Will you come back tomorrow to oversee the monitoring? No, this was a one-time thing. Evelyn appeared in the doorway like she'd been waiting. Maybe she had been. Mr. Walker, can we talk? I'm pretty talked out. 5 minutes. Ethan looked at Carter, Adrian, and Isaac. Good work tonight. You asked the right questions. That matters more than having the right answers. Then he followed Evelyn to a conference room with windows that showed a city starting to wake up. The heat wave had broken. Rain was falling, washing the unseasonable warmth away. Evelyn closed the door. Thank you. I know that's insufficient, but thank you. You're welcome. I want to offer you a position. Chief Infrastructure Officer, full authority over all technical systems. Name your salary. Ethan had been expecting this. No. You don't want to think about it? I don't need to. I have a job starting Monday. I have a daughter who needs stability. I did this because clients were suffering, not because I wanted to come back. Evelyn sat down across from him. Then help me understand something. You built all this. You clearly care about it. Why walk away? Because I learned something 3 years ago when my wife died. Ethan's voice was quiet. I learned that being brilliant at your job means nothing if you miss your daughter's childhood. I learned that titles and recognition and corner offices matter a lot less than being home for dinner. You could have both. We could structure it so— No, you couldn't. Ethan cut her off gently. Chief Infrastructure Officer isn't a 9-to-5 job. It's the job I had when I was 25 and could work 70-hour weeks. I'm 32 now, and I have different priorities. What if I could guarantee work-life balance? You can't guarantee that, not in this role. Not in this company. Ethan stood up. But I will consult. If you have questions, if something breaks, if you need someone who understands the architecture, call me. I'll help, just not as an employee. Evelyn looked like she wanted to argue more, but something in his face stopped her. Consultant rates, then, with a retainer. Fair enough. And Mr. Walker, I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen again. That knowledge doesn't get lost, that people who build things get recognized for building them. Good luck with that. Ethan headed for the door. Systems are easy. People are complicated. He walked out of Nexora Systems at 5:03 a.m. The sun was starting to think about rising. The rain had slowed to a drizzle that felt clean after the heat wave. His phone had 7 missed calls from Mrs. Chen and 3 text messages, all variations of, "Call me when you can, Mia's fine but worried." He called from the parking lot. "Ethan, is everything okay?" "Yeah, sorry, work ran late. Really late." "Mia woke up at midnight asking for you. I told her you were fixing something important." Guilt squeezed his chest. "Is she asleep now?" "Finally." "About an hour ago." Mrs. Chen's voice softened. "Whatever you were fixing, I hope it was worth missing bedtime." "Honestly, I'm not sure." "Come get some sleep. I'll keep her for breakfast. You look like you need rest more than you need to make scrambled eggs." "You don't even know what I look like right now." "I know what you sound like. That's enough." Ethan drove home through empty streets, parked in his usual spot, dragged himself up 3 flights of stairs. His apartment was quiet, dark. He didn't bother turning on lights, just fell onto his bed fully clothed. He was asleep in seconds. When he woke up, sun was streaming through windows and his phone said 11:47 a.m. He had messages, voicemails, emails. The first email was from Evelyn Carter with a contract attachment. Consultant agreement, 40 hours monthly retainer, rate that was 3 times what Nexora had paid him as a technician. The second email was from Dataline Industries. "Congratulations. They wanted him to start Monday as planned. Here are the onboarding documents." The third email was from Carter Reeves, just 2 sentences. "Thank you for last night. I learned more in 8 hours than I did in 4 years at Silver Point." Ethan lay in bed staring at his ceiling, trying to figure out how he felt. Satisfied? Vindicated? Exhausted? Mostly he felt like he needed coffee and to see his daughter. He showered, changed clothes, went downstairs. Mrs. Chen opened her door before he could knock. "Daddy!" Mia launched herself at him. "You were gone so long. Mrs. Chen said you were being a superhero." "I don't know about superhero, but I fixed something broken." "Like when you fix my toys?" "Kind of like that, but bigger." Mrs. Chen handed him a plate with eggs and toast. "Eat. You look terrible." "Thanks." "It's a compliment. Looking terrible after fixing something important is better than looking good after doing nothing." Ethan ate standing up while Mia told him about her night, about the movie Mrs. Chen had let her watch, about the dream she'd had about ducks learning to fly airplanes, normal 6-year-old things that mattered more than anything that had happened in a server room last night. After breakfast, they went home. Mia wanted to play a game involving complex rules she'd invented that morning. Ethan played it, making up his understanding as he went, letting her win because that's what made her laugh. Around 2 p.m., his phone rang. Evelyn Carter. "Mr. Walker, I wanted to update you. All 47 clients are back online and stable. We've heard from 16 of them already. Most are surprisingly understanding given the circumstances." "That's good." Dominic Hale has tendered his resignation. Ethan wasn't sure what to say to that. That wasn't necessary. It was to him. He feels responsible for the restructuring that caused this. Evelyn paused. "Between you and me, I think he's right to feel responsible, but I also don't think he's entirely to blame. Systems fail because of multiple factors, rarely just one person's decision." Spoken like someone who builds reliable systems. She sounded tired. "The board is meeting Monday to discuss what happened. They'll want to know how we prevent this going forward. Document everything, not just procedures, but principles. Make sure knowledge isn't trapped in one person's head. Ethan watched Mia arranging her stuffed animals in elaborate formations. And maybe trust the people who've been there longer than they've been impressive. Noted. Are you sure about the CIO position? Final offer. I'm sure. Then I'll settle for having you on retainer. Thank you again, Mr. Walker. After she hung up, Ethan sat on his couch feeling the weight of the last 24 hours settle into his bones. He'd done it. Fixed what they'd broken. Proved something he'd never needed to prove before. And now he got to go back to being invisible in a different company, starting over with people who wouldn't know his history. Except he wasn't the same person who'd been invisible at Nyxora. Something had shifted. He'd remembered what it felt like to build something meaningful, to solve problems that mattered, to teach people who actually wanted to learn. Daddy, you're doing your thinking face again, Mia said, abandoning her stuffed animals to climb onto the couch beside him. Sorry, baby. Just processing some stuff. Did you fix the thing at work? Yeah, I fixed it. Are you going back there? No, I'm starting somewhere new on Monday. She considered this. Will they be nice to you? The question hit him harder than it should have. I hope so. If they're not, you should tell them I said they have to be, because you're the best daddy and you fix things. Ethan pulled her into a hug, squeezing maybe a little too tight. Deal. I'll pass along the message. That night, they made the triple batch of cookies they'd promised. Chocolate chip, Mia's favorite. She ate 3 before dinner, which Ethan allowed because sometimes breaking rules about cookies before dinner mattered less than keeping promises. Sunday passed in the comfortable routine of weekend life. Library in the morning, where Mia got 6 books about space. Park in the afternoon, where she played on the swings while Ethan sat on a bench and watched. Dinner was spaghetti again because she'd declared it her favorite and refused to consider alternatives. During her bath, Ethan's phone buzzed. Text from Carter. Monitoring shows everything stable, no anomalies. I think we actually did it. Ethan typed back. You did it. I just showed you how. That's not how it felt. That's because you're learning the difference between knowing things and understanding them. Keep going. Monday morning arrived with the kind of certainty that weekdays had. Ethan dropped Mia at school, kissed her goodbye, promised to pick her up on time. Then he drove across town to Dataline Industries, to a building he'd never been inside, to start a job that would let him be competent without being exceptional. The onboarding was standard. Paperwork, system access, meeting the team who all seemed friendly enough. His manager, a woman named Patricia, who was 50-something and had the comfortable confidence of someone who'd stopped trying to impress people years ago, showed him to his desk. You'll be working on infrastructure monitoring mostly, making sure nothing breaks. Boring but essential. Boring and essential is exactly what I'm looking for, Ethan said. Good. Because I read your resume. You're overqualified for this position. I need to know you're not going to get bored and leave in 6 months. I have a 6-year-old daughter who needs stability more than I need excitement. This job is perfect. Patricia smiled. Then welcome aboard. Coffee's in the break room, bathrooms down the hall, and if anything catches fire, metaphorically speaking, my office is always open. Ethan spent his first day learning Dataline systems, which were straightforward and well documented. Nobody had built anything unnecessarily complex. Nobody had hidden critical architecture in undocumented code. It was refreshingly transparent. At 5:15 p.m., he logged off his computer, grabbed his jacket, and headed for his car. He'd pick up Mia, make dinner, help with homework, do the bedtime routine. Tomorrow, he'd do it again. It was exactly the life he'd chosen. His phone buzzed as he reached the parking lot. Email from Nyxora's legal department with the finalized consultant contract. He skimmed it, signed it digitally, sent it back. Another email came in right after. From Evelyn. Mr. Walker, the board meeting went well. I've been authorized to establish a documentation initiative and knowledge preservation program. Would you be willing to consult on its design? Paid, of course, on your schedule. Ethan stood beside his car, reading the email twice. This was how it started. One consulting project became 2, became 3, became someone realizing they needed you full time. But maybe that was okay. Maybe he could do both. Be present for Mia and occasionally share knowledge that mattered. He typed back, happy to help. Send me the project scope and we'll discuss timing. Then he drove to Mia's school, parked in the pickup lane, waited for her to come running out with her backpack bouncing and her smile bright enough to make everything else fade into background noise. "How was school?" he asked as she climbed into her car seat. "We learned about Mars. Did you know it's red because of rust? That's basically like the planet is an old car." That's actually a pretty good analogy. "And teacher said next week we're going to build model rockets, and I want to make mine purple. And can we stop at the craft store?" Craft store it is. They stopped for supplies, then went home. Dinner was fish sticks again because it was Monday. Homework was reading practice and simple math. Bath time included a lengthy explanation of rocket propulsion that Mia had mostly invented but delivered with complete confidence. After she was asleep, Ethan sat at his kitchen table with his laptop and started drafting the documentation framework Evelyn had asked about. How to preserve knowledge, how to make critical information visible, how to prevent another situation where the person who built something became invisible until things broke. He worked for an hour, then closed his laptop and went to check on Mia one more time. She was tangled in her blankets, Mr. Whiskers fallen to the floor again. Ethan tucked the rabbit back beside her, smoothed her hair, stood there for a moment just watching her breathe. This was what mattered. Not saving companies or being recognized for brilliance or proving anything to anyone. This, right here. A 6-year-old sleeping soundly because her father had kept his promises about being present. Everything else was just noise. Ethan went to his own room, set his alarm for tomorrow morning, and fell asleep to the sound of rain that had started up again. Washing the city clean for another week of ordinary days that were more valuable than any extraordinary ones could ever be. 3 weeks into his new job at Dataline Industries, Ethan had settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable in ways Nexora never had. He arrived at 8:30, left at 5, and nobody questioned whether he was ambitious enough or committed enough or whatever enough. Patricia had been right. The work was boring in the best possible way. Systems that stayed stable, problems that got solved before they became crises, documentation that actually documented things. It should have been perfect, but something was nagging at him, had been since that night in the server room when he'd taught 3 engineers how to rebuild what they'd broken. Not regret exactly, more like unfinished business. His phone buzzed during lunch. Text from Carter. "Quick question about the thermal state documentation you sent. Section 4.2 mentions adaptive thresholds but doesn't specify the learning rate. Is that intentional or did I miss something?" Ethan smiled despite himself. Carter had been texting every few days with increasingly sophisticated questions. The guy was actually learning, not just following instructions. He typed back, "Learning rate adjusts dynamically based on load variance. There's no fixed value. System determines optimal rate through observation." 3 dots appeared. Then, "That's kind of brilliant and terrifying. We're trusting the system to teach itself?" "You've been trusting it to do that for 7 years. You just didn't know it." "Fair point, thanks." Ethan set his phone down and went back to his sandwich, but the nagging feeling remained. He'd given Nexora the documentation they'd asked for, had walked them through the restoration, had made himself available for questions. He'd done everything right. So why did it feel incomplete? That evening, after Mia was in bed, Ethan pulled up the consultant project Evelyn had sent him. Knowledge Preservation Framework. How to prevent critical expertise from becoming invisible. He'd been putting it off for 2 weeks, telling himself he was too busy settling into the new job. But the truth was simpler and more uncomfortable. He didn't know how to solve a problem that was fundamentally about people, not systems. You could document procedures. You could write elegant code. But you couldn't force people to value knowledge that came in packages they didn't expect. You couldn't make someone see a maintenance technician as an architect just because you wrote it down somewhere. His phone rang. Evelyn Carter. "Mr. Walker, sorry to call so late. Do you have a minute?" "Sure, what's going on?" The board approved the knowledge preservation program. Full budget, dedicated team, the works. But I'm realizing I don't actually know what I'm building. I've read a dozen case studies from other companies and they all feel hollow, like they're documenting the what without understanding the why. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "That's because most of them are." "So how do I do it right?" "You can't. Not completely." Ethan heard her start to protest and kept talking. Knowledge preservation assumes knowledge is a thing you can capture and store. But the stuff that really matters, the principles, the judgment, the why behind decisions, that's not knowledge. That's wisdom. And wisdom doesn't transfer through documentation. Then how does it transfer? Through relationships, through mentorship, through actually valuing the people who have it instead of just mining them for information when things break. The line was quiet for a moment. Then Evelyn said, "That's not what I wanted to hear. I know you wanted me to give you a framework you could implement, a system you could build. But this isn't a systems problem. It's a culture problem. Can you help me fix it anyway?" Ethan thought about his daughter sleeping down the hall, thought about the promise he'd made to himself about stability and boundaries and not getting pulled back into corporate complexity. Then he thought about Carter asking thoughtful questions, about Isaac and Adrian actually wanting to understand instead of just wanting to be right, about the possibility that maybe something good could come from what had been broken. "I'll consult on it, but I'm not coming back as an employee. That's non-negotiable." "Understood. Can you come in Friday? I'd like you to meet with the team we're putting together for this." "Friday afternoon. I have to pick up my daughter at 3:30. "We'll work around your schedule." After she hung up, Ethan sat in his quiet apartment wondering if he was making a mistake. Getting more involved, even as a consultant, meant getting more invested. An investment led to attachment, which led to caring about outcomes, which led to exactly the kind of stress he'd walked away from. But maybe walking away completely had been its own kind of mistake. Maybe there was a middle path between invisible and indispensable. Friday afternoon, Ethan drove to Nexora Systems for the third time since being fired. The building felt different now. People nodded to him in the lobby. The security guard waved him through without checking ID. He wasn't invisible anymore, which was both validating and uncomfortable. Evelyn met him in a conference room on the 4th floor. With her were 5 people Ethan didn't recognize, all holding tablets and looking serious. "Mr. Walker, thank you for coming. This is the knowledge management team. Sarah heads up technical documentation, Marcus handles training programs, Jennifer's from HR, David's our new VP of engineering, and you've met Carter." Carter was sitting at the far end of the table, looking relieved to see a familiar face. Ethan shook hands with everyone, then took a seat. "So what exactly are we trying to accomplish here?" Sarah jumped in first. "We're developing a comprehensive documentation system that captures not just procedures, but decision rationale, architectural principles, and institutional knowledge." "That sounds nice in theory," Ethan said, "but nobody reads comprehensive documentation. It's too big, too abstract. People look up specific answers to specific problems." "Then what do you suggest?" Sarah looked defensive. "I suggest you stop thinking about documentation as an archive and start thinking about it as a conversation. Living documentation that gets updated by the people using it, not just the people writing it." Marcus leaned forward. "How do we incentivize engineers to contribute to documentation? Most see it as busy work. You make it part of how they solve problems. When someone figures something out, the documentation system prompts them to explain how. Not as an extra step, but as part of the solution process." Ethan looked at Carter. "Tell them about the thermal state memory questions you've been asking me." Carter straightened up. "I've been texting Mr. Walker every few days with questions about the infrastructure. He answers them. I document the answers in our internal wiki." "And does anyone else read that wiki?" Ethan asked. "Yeah, actually. Adrian and Isaac both reference it. And I've gotten questions from the Portland team about some of the entries. That's living documentation. It exists because people need it, not because someone mandated it." Ethan turned to Sarah. "Your comprehensive system will sit unused unless it's solving immediate problems for people." They talked for 90 minutes, working through ideas that ranged from practical to wishful thinking. Ethan found himself getting more engaged than he'd planned, drawing diagrams on the whiteboard to explain how knowledge flowed through organizations. At 3:15, he checked his watch. "I need to leave in 10 minutes. Anything critical we haven't covered?" David, the VP of engineering, spoke up for the first time. "I have a question that's probably outside the scope of this meeting, but I'm curious about your decision not to come back as CIO. Evelyn's told me what happened, how you built all this. Why walk away?" Ethan considered the question. "Because being good at something doesn't mean you have to build your life around it. I'm good at infrastructure architecture. I'm also a father, and right now being a good father matters more to me than being a brilliant engineer." "Those aren't mutually exclusive. In theory, no. In practice?" Ethan shook his head. CIO of a company this size means 80-hour weeks, means being on call constantly, Means missing bedtimes and school plays and all the ordinary moments that add up to a childhood. I did that math 3 years ago, and the numbers didn't work. Jennifer from HR looked thoughtful. What if we could make those numbers work? Restructure the role so it didn't require that kind of commitment? You can't. Not honestly. You can say you will, you can put it in a contract, but when a crisis hits, and crises always hit, expectations change. The person who says they'll respect work-life balance becomes the person asking why you're leaving at 5:30 when the infrastructure is unstable. The room was quiet. Ethan had apparently said something that resonated or offended. He couldn't tell which. Evelyn broke the silence. You're right, and that's something we need to fix, not just for this role, but across the company. Because if we're losing people like you because of unsustainable expectations, we're building on a foundation that will eventually collapse. Good luck with that, Ethan said, standing up. Culture change is harder than infrastructure design. He made it to Mia's school with 3 minutes to spare. She came running out with her usual enthusiasm, backpack bouncing. Daddy, we made volcanoes today with baking soda, and they exploded everywhere, and teacher said mine was very enthusiastic. Enthusiastic is a good word for volcanoes. Can we make one at home? Absolutely, this weekend. They stopped at the grocery store for volcano supplies, then headed home. While Mia did homework at the kitchen table, Ethan's phone buzzed with an email from David, the VP of Engineering. Mr. Walker, your comments about work-life balance got me thinking. Would you be willing to consult on role design as well? Help us figure out how to structure senior technical positions in ways that don't require sacrificing personal life? I realize this is expanding scope significantly, but I think it's important work. Ethan read it twice. This was scope creep. This was getting pulled deeper into an organization he'd decided to leave. This was exactly what he told himself he wouldn't do. He typed back, "Let me think about it." That night, after Mia was asleep, Ethan found himself thinking about all the engineers he'd worked with over the years who'd burned out, who'd sacrificed marriages and health and relationships for jobs that replaced them within weeks of their departure. He thought about the quiet tragedy of building brilliant systems for companies that didn't value the humans who built them. And he thought about whether he could actually change any of that, or if he'd just be documenting problems without solving them. His phone rang. Carter again. "Hey, sorry to bother you at night. Not about infrastructure this time." "What's up?" "David told me about his email, about redesigning roles. I wanted to say something I didn't want to say in the meeting." "Okay. You changed my whole understanding of what engineering is." Carter's voice was serious. "Not just the technical stuff, though that was humbling, but the way you talk about priorities, about what matters. I've been doing this job for 12 years, and I've never once stopped to ask if the way we work is actually sustainable." "And now you are?" "Yeah, my wife's pregnant, due in March. And I'm looking at the way I've been working and realizing it's not compatible with being the kind of father I want to be." He paused. "You showed me that choosing differently is possible, that you can be technically brilliant and still prioritize other things." Ethan didn't know what to say to that. He'd been so focused on his own choices that he hadn't considered they might influence anyone else's. "Congratulations on the baby," he said finally. "Thanks. And thanks for making me question everything I thought I knew about career success." After Carter hung up, Ethan sat with his laptop and pulled up David's email again. Role design, sustainable expectations, culture change. It was ambitious, probably impossible, definitely outside his comfort zone. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the knowledge worth preserving wasn't just technical. Maybe it was the wisdom that came from making hard choices and living with the consequences. He typed a response. "I'll consult on role design under one condition. I get to include real talk about trade-offs. No corporate speak about having it all. Honest conversation about what different choices actually cost." David's response came back in minutes. "Deal. That's exactly what we need." Over the next month, Ethan found himself splitting time between Dataline and Nexora in ways that felt strange but workable. His regular job stayed regular. Stable hours, boring problems, reliable paycheck. His consulting work became the place where he pushed boundaries and asked uncomfortable questions. The role design project turned into something bigger than anyone had anticipated. Ethan interviewed engineers across Nexora, asking about their lives outside work, about what they'd sacrificed for their careers. about what they'd do differently if they could. The answers were devastating in their honesty. I missed my daughter's first steps because I was debugging production code at 2 a.m. My marriage ended because I was always choosing work over presents. I haven't had dinner with my family on a weeknight in 3 years. Ethan compiled it all into a presentation that he delivered to Nexora's executive team on a Tuesday afternoon in December. Evelyn was there, David, the entire board of directors. He'd never spoken to an audience this senior before. He didn't pull punches. You're burning through talented people because you've built a culture that rewards presence over productivity, that measures commitment by hours instead of outcomes, that treats work-life balance as a perk instead of a necessity. Ethan pulled up slide after slide of anonymous quotes from engineers. These aren't lazy people. They're brilliant people who are making themselves sick for companies that will replace them without hesitation. One of the board members interrupted. "What do you propose we do about it? We're competing in a global market with companies that work around the clock. You compete by being better, not by being more demanding. You build systems that don't require heroics to maintain. You hire enough people to distribute load reasonably. You promote people who deliver results in 40 hours instead of people who work 80. Ethan met the board member's eyes. "And you accept that this might mean slightly lower short-term profits in exchange for sustainable long-term success." Another board member spoke up. "You're asking us to fundamentally change how we operate." "I'm telling you what's already changing, whether you want it to or not. The engineers who used to sacrifice everything for their careers are making different choices now. You can adapt to that reality, or you can keep losing talent and wondering why." After the presentation, Ethan gathered his materials and headed for the door. Evelyn caught up with him in the hallway. "That was either career suicide or brilliant. I'm not sure which. I'm a consultant. I get to tell the truth and leave." "Do you think they'll actually change anything?" Ethan shrugged. "Some of them will. The ones who are scared enough or smart enough. The others will keep doing what they've always done until it stops working." "Which category am I in?" He looked at her directly. "You brought me back to fix a crisis. You kept me around to fix a culture. That suggests you're willing to change. Whether you're capable of it long term, I don't know. That's on you." Evelyn smiled, but it looked tired. "You don't make anything easy, do you? If it was easy, you wouldn't need a consultant." Walking to his car, Ethan felt the weight of what he'd just done. He'd basically told a Fortune 500 board of directors that their entire operational philosophy was broken. That was either brave or stupid, and he wasn't sure he knew the difference anymore. His phone buzzed. Text from Patricia at Dataline. "Heard you gave Nexora's board an earful. Good for you. See you tomorrow?" Ethan stared at the message, confused. How did Patricia already know about a presentation that ended 20 minutes ago? He called her. "How did you hear about that?" "David's on our advisory board. He texted me asking if you were looking for full-time work because apparently you just revolutionized their thinking on talent management." Patricia laughed. "I told him you're happy here, but he's welcome to dream." "I'm not leaving Dataline." "I know, but it's nice to be wanted, right?" After hanging up, Ethan sat in his car watching the winter sun set earlier than it should. 3 months ago, he'd been invisible. Now he had 2 companies fighting over his time and expertise. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt complicated. He picked up Mia from after-school care, listening to her explain the complex social dynamics of first-grade recess politics. They stopped for pizza because it was Tuesday, and that was the deal. At home, she wanted help building a blanket fort, which evolved into an elaborate castle with multiple rooms and strict entry requirements. "No grown-ups in the castle except you," Mia declared, "because you helped build it." "What about Mrs. Chen?" "She can visit, but she has to knock first." They ate dinner in the blanket fort, which violated several food-in-the-living-room rules but made Mia happy enough that Ethan didn't care. Later, after the bedtime routine and final sips of water and checking for monsters, Ethan sat at his kitchen table with his laptop. He had emails to answer, documentation to review, decisions to make about how much more consulting work he could take on. But instead, he pulled up a blank document and started writing something different. Not for Nexora or Dataline or anyone else, just for himself. He wrote about being invisible and what he'd learned from it, about the difference between being valued and being seen, about how easy it was to confuse career success with personal worth, about choosing ordinary days with his daughter over extraordinary achievements in server rooms. He wrote for an hour, maybe more, putting words to thoughts he'd been carrying since that night when everything collapsed and he had to decide whether to save people who hadn't valued him. When he finished, he read it back and realized he'd written something that might help other people facing similar choices. The engineers burning out, the parents missing childhoods, the brilliant people making themselves invisible because that's what survival required. On impulse, he posted it to one of the technical forums he'd been active on years ago. No corporate polish, no consultant voice, just honest reflection from someone who'd been on both sides of the visibility divide. Then he closed his laptop and went to bed, not expecting anything to come of it. By morning, the post had 400 comments. Engineers sharing their own stories, parents talking about sacrifices they'd made, people thanking him for putting words to feelings they couldn't articulate. A few recruiters offering jobs, which Ethan ignored. Several companies asking if he'd consult on culture change, which he considered. One comment stood out from a user named TechDad47. I just turned down a promotion because it would mean missing my kid's entire childhood. Your post made me feel less crazy for that choice. Thank you. Ethan screenshot it and sent it to Carter with a message. This is the knowledge worth preserving, not just technical stuff, the human cost of our choices. Carter's response? Agreed. But how do you preserve that? Can't exactly put it in a wiki. You preserve it by living it, by being visible about your priorities, by showing people that choosing differently is possible. The conversation continued over the next few days, expanding to include Isaac and Adrian, then Sarah from documentation, then more engineers across Nexora. What started as a discussion about Ethan's forum post became a broader conversation about how they wanted to work, what they were willing to sacrifice, what they weren't. David pulled Ethan aside during his next consulting visit. You've accidentally started a movement. Engineers are questioning everything. Some executives are panicking. Should I apologize? Hell no. This is exactly what we needed. Uncomfortable questions that force us to examine our assumptions. David looked both excited and terrified. The board approved a pilot program. Flexible hours, mandatory vacation enforcement, protected personal time. We're testing it with the infrastructure team first. Carter's team? Yeah, they volunteered, or Carter volunteered them. Same thing. Ethan felt something shift in his chest. Not quite hope, but possibility. The chance that maybe, just maybe, talking honestly about hard things could lead to actual change. 2 weeks later, Nexora announced its new work-life integration policy. It made headlines in tech publications, sparked debates on industry forums, and prompted half a dozen other companies to examine their own cultures. Ethan watched it unfold from a careful distance, continuing his regular job at Dataline while consulting on implementation at Nexora. The policy wasn't perfect. Some managers fought it, some employees abused it, some systems needed adjustment. But it was different, meaningfully different. Carter sent him updates weekly. I left at 5:30 yesterday and nobody looked at me weird. Isaac took his first full vacation in 4 years. Adrian's coaching his daughter's soccer team on weekends without feeling guilty. Small changes, ordinary victories, the kind that didn't make headlines but made lives livable. In January, Evelyn called with a final offer. CIO position, redesigned based on your recommendations. 40-hour weeks maximum, mandatory work-life boundaries, protected personal time. We've restructured it so the role is manageable by a human being instead of requiring a martyr. That's impressive, Ethan said, but I'm still not interested. I had to try. She didn't sound surprised. Can I ask why? You've basically designed your perfect job. Because I already have a job that works. And because Nexora needs someone who wants to be CIO. I never wanted the title. I just wanted to build good systems and go home to my daughter. Fair enough. Will you stay on as consultant? For the culture stuff, yeah. The technical infrastructure you've got covered now. Thanks to you. Thanks to Carter and his team actually wanting to learn. Ethan looked at his calendar, at the careful balance he'd built between Dataline and consulting and being present for Mia. They don't need me anymore. That was always the goal. After hanging up, Ethan sat in his quiet apartment feeling something close to peace. He'd done what he set out to do, fixed what was broken, taught what could be learned, and walked away before getting pulled back into patterns that didn't serve him. His phone buzzed. text from Mia's school. Hi, Mr. Walker. This is Ms. Peterson. Mia told me you're an engineer who helps companies treat people better. Would you be willing to speak at Career Day next month? Ethan laughed out loud. His daughter had apparently been sharing his work in show-and-tell terms. He typed back, happy to. Let me know when. That Saturday, he and Mia made the volcano they'd been planning. It was messier than expected, more enthusiastic than scientific, and completely perfect. Baking soda and vinegar erupted across the kitchen table while Mia shrieked with delight. Again, she demanded. Make it bigger. They made it bigger, then bigger still. By the end, they had a disaster zone that would take an hour to clean up, and memories that would last considerably longer. While wiping down the table, Ethan's phone rang. Unknown number. He answered it. Mr. Walker, this is James Chen from TechCore Industries. I read your forum post about visibility and career choices. We're struggling with retention and burnout. Would you consider consulting with us? Ethan looked at his daughter, covered in baking soda, grinning like she'd just conquered the world. Looked at his kitchen, destroyed in the best possible way. Looked at his calendar, already balancing 2 jobs and parenthood and the ordinary chaos of life. Send me the details, he said. I'll see if I can fit it in. Because that was the thing he'd learned through all of this. You didn't have to choose between being brilliant and being present. You just had to be honest about your priorities and firm about your boundaries. You had to be willing to be invisible when it served you and visible when it mattered. You had to know the difference between proving yourself and living your values. You had to understand that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you could do was choose ordinary happiness over extraordinary achievement. Over the next few months, Ethan's consulting practice grew in unexpected directions. He worked with companies on culture change, on role design, on making technical careers sustainable for humans instead of machines. He spoke at conferences about work-life integration, wrote articles about the cost of constant availability, advised startups on building sustainable growth. He did all of it on his terms. 40 hours a week maximum, including his data-line job. No travel that required overnight stays. Nothing that conflicted with picking up Mia from school or making Tuesday pizza nights sacred. Some companies thought his boundaries were unreasonable. Those companies didn't hire him. The ones that did found that his constraints forced them to be more focused, more intentional, more honest about what they actually needed versus what they thought they needed. By spring, Ethan had quietly become one of the most sought-after consultants in tech. Not for his technical brilliance, but for his willingness to tell uncomfortable truths about how the industry treated people. And through it all, he stayed committed to the promises that mattered most. Pancakes on Saturday mornings, library trips on Sundays, bedtime stories every night. The ordinary rhythms of a life built around presence instead of achievement. One evening in April, Ethan got a call from Evelyn with news. The infrastructure team hit a milestone today. 1 year of operations with 0 major incidents. No catastrophic failures, no emergency calls at 2 a.m., no heroic saves required. That's great. Tell Carter congratulations. I am telling you congratulations. You built a system that worked reliably for 7 years. Then you rebuilt it in a way that Carter's team could actually maintain. That's remarkable. It's just good engineering. Build it right the first time, document it properly, train people thoroughly. It's more than that, and you know it. Evelyn paused. I wanted to thank you for everything, for fixing our infrastructure, for changing our culture, for showing us what we were missing. This company is fundamentally different because of you. It's different because you were willing to change. I just pointed out what needed changing. Still, thank you. After she hung up, Ethan sat on his couch with Mia beside him, watching her color an elaborate picture of what she claimed was a space station but looked more like a purple castle. Daddy, when I grow up, can I be an engineer like you? You can be anything you want, baby. But if I'm an engineer, will I have to work all the time and miss stuff? The question hit him harder than it should have. No. You get to decide how you work. Some people choose to work all the time. Some people choose differently. What did you choose? I chose you, every time. She considered this, then went back to her coloring. Good, because I would miss you if you worked all the time. I'd miss you too. That night, after Mia was asleep, Ethan pulled up his forum post from months ago and read through the comments again. Hundreds of them now. People still sharing stories and asking questions and thanking him for starting a conversation. One new comment caught his eye from someone named InfraArchitect23. I just quit a CIO job that was destroying my health and relationships. Your post gave me permission to value myself over my career. Scary as hell, but feels right. Thank you. Ethan typed a response. It stays scary, but it also stays right. Good luck. Then he closed his laptop and went to bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring the same balanced routine he'd built. Work that mattered but didn't consume him. Consulting that challenged him but didn't own him. Time with his daughter that reminded him why all the other choices were worth making. He'd started as an invisible maintenance technician, become briefly indispensable during a crisis, and chosen to be neither. He'd found a third path, one that let him use his talents without sacrificing his life to them. It wasn't the story people usually told about career success. There was no corner office, no executive title, no dramatic rise to power. Just a man who'd figured out what mattered to him and built his life around it, consequences and all. But lying there in the dark of his ordinary apartment, listening to rain tap against windows and his daughter breathe down the hall, Ethan knew something that corner offices and titles could never teach. He knew that being invisible had taught him to see clearly, that being overlooked had shown him what truly mattered, that losing everything had given him the freedom to choose what to build back. And he knew that the most valuable thing he'd ever created wasn't an infrastructure that powered 47 companies. It was a life where he could be home for pancakes, present for bedtime stories, and available for Tuesday pizza nights without guilt or compromise. That was the knowledge worth preserving. That was the wisdom worth sharing. That was the choice that made him, finally, genuinely successful in the ways that actually counted.